One thing that I learned in rabbinical school that they didn't teach us in the classroom is that when we look at a page of text, what matters is not only what's written in the black ink, but what emerges from the white space around the letters. In seminary, I would study Talmud all day, every day, and most of the night too. I spent years reveling in the intellectual and the spiritual odysseys of our rabbis, and I have to admit that I felt like the very fact of women studying Talmud was some kind of cosmic tikkun, some act of healing. And so my female colleagues and I would lend our voices and our questions and our tears to the chorus of rabbis who came before us, but didn't ever hear from anyone like us. I learned to look for wisdom not only in our received traditions, but also in the silence, in the space that held the voices that went unrecorded throughout history. It's Yom Kippur today, and as we move through the liturgy, we see how relentless it is in its assumption that yes, under scrutiny, we all can do better. As the hours pass and as the fast starts to soften our hardened hearts, I want to talk today about the massive cultural awakening around sexual harassment and sexual assault this past year. What wisdom does our Jewish tradition offer to help hold pain and humiliation and trauma, to honor immeasurable strength and persistence and beauty in truth tellers, and to build new cultural norms that actually reflect who we want to be as a society? Listen to the story of Dinah from the book of Genesis. Dinah was a strong girl, and she had to be, because she was the only daughter among 12 rowdy sons who eventually became the 12 tribes of Israel. She was living in a man's world, which is probably why she went out one day in order to try to meet some of the girls in the neighborhood. Our tradition, so wedded to patriarchy, only mentions Dinah for the first time that day. The book of Genesis somehow neglects to mention her birth, despite its extensive attention to the birth and naming of each one of her brothers. And even then, she's only mentioned on this day because Shem, the leader of one of the neighboring tribes, violently takes her body and her dignity. He sees her, he takes her, he rapes her, he humiliates her, says Genesis chapter 34. And then he thinks he falls in love with her, and he decides that he would like to keep her. Jacob, Dinah's father, learns that his daughter has been abducted and assaulted. And inexplicably, he, the great deceiver, the lover, the dreamer, the one who wrestled with God and man, remains completely silent. Later, Jacob's sons, Dinah's brothers, come home from working in the field, and they hear about what happened. Unlike their father, they are livid. They're fired up with righteous anger at the indignity visited not upon their sister, but upon their family. The honor of their tribe has been challenged. And two of her brothers, Shimon and Levi, take their swords and they decimate Shem. They slaughter every man in the town. They retrieve their sister Dinah and they bring her home. They also incidentally take with them all of Shechem's flocks, cattle, and wealth, and all of the women and children as captives. That is a warped sense of justice. It's only then that Jacob, our patriarch, finds his words. He is outraged, but not necessarily by the rape or even by his son's brutality, but by the precarious position that their war on Shechem has put him in. Achartem oti, you have discomposed me, he says. Listen to that word, discomposed. You've unsettled things for me. You've upset the political order for me. Now I will be hated among all the inhabitants of the land who will band together to annihilate me. And our story closes with Shimon and Levi given the last word. Should we have let our sister be treated like a whore? They ask. This is Dina's story, but where's her voice? Instead, we see her father, the great moral compass of the family, the model of spiritual mobility, failed to protect his child before, during, and after her assault. And we see her brothers, with their righteous fury, only wreak more trauma on more victims, including a whole new population of women captives. Silence and violence, twin responses to the most explicit sexual assault in the Torah. And Dina, denied agency not only by her attacker and by those entrusted to protect and to support her, but also by our tradition, which fails altogether to record her voice or chronicle her experience. And if only Dina's story ended there would be endless lessons for us about how not to respond to sexual violence. But the cruelty toward Dina persists for many generations. Our beloved rabbis got so much right. Rabbinic literature reveals not only intellectual rigor, but a profound sensitivity to and understanding of the complexities of the human experience. This is what made me fall in love with Talmud the very first time I sat down to learn. But they who wrote so often, with astonishing sensitivity and compassion, they really missed the mark with Dina. It's Rashi who points to the language of the narrative. Vatetse Dina bat Leah, asher yilda leYaakov, lirot bivnot haaretz. And Dina, the daughter of Leah, whom she had borne to Jacob, went out to meet some girls in the neighborhood. Why is she called, Rashi asks, first and foremost, daughter of Leah, rather than daughter of Jacob? Because when Dina went out that day, on the day of her assault, he says, she was just like her mother Leah, who went out years before trying to have sex with Jacob. You know, Ke'ima Kavita, like mother, like daughter. Of course, this interpretation is completely a choice. The very same verb, vatetse Dina, and Dina went out, describes Jacob's going out previously in the Torah, vayetze Yaakov mi Beersheva. However, there, Rashi conveniently reads this going out not as a sign of sexual assertiveness, but rather as a sign of Jacob's righteousness. And it's not only the ancient and the medieval commentaries that attack Dina's credibility and blame her outright for this assault. Even contemporary scholars find evidence of her unconventional behavior. They say girls of marriageable age wouldn't normally leave a rural encampment and go unchaperoned into an alien city. Another commentary writes, Dina went out in contradiction to the code of modesty befitting a daughter of Jacob. In other words, this whole mess would never have happened had she not worn such a short skirt. The assumption of the bearers of our sacred tradition when confronting the story of the abduction and rape of one of our girls is that it's her fault, that she's promiscuous, immodest, that she asked for it, just like her mama did years before. Even when the rapist is an enemy of Israel, our rabbis cannot comprehend a scenario in which Dina is not to blame. How much has changed in our world over the last 2,000 years? And yet, how much is exactly the same? For many years, I have wondered, what was it like for Dina when she finally escapes Shem to go home to her violent, rageful brothers and her silent, impotent father, all completely ill-equipped to deal with her trauma? And I wonder, what has it been like for every girl and woman who has learned this story, like I did, over the past 2,000 years, to hear the commentators focus on what Dina was wearing and where she was playing, rather than reflect on Shechem's toxic assumption that he had rightful ownership of the neighbor girl's body. It's very clear to me that when Dina gets her reckoning, it's not only Shechem who will be held responsible for this travesty. It's also her brothers. It's also her father. It's also our rabbis and our tradition, all of it complicit in Dina's shaming. Dina's story reveals the reality of a society so rooted in patriarchal assumptions that not only assault and abuse, but shaming, blaming, and invisibilizing girls and women was more the norm than the exception. Sexual assault, abuse, and harassment transcend geography and generation. In some ways, misogyny is the great cultural unifier. I heard from many of you about how surprised you were by the sheer enormity of the reach of assault and harassment when more than 12 million people posted their Me Too stories within the first 48 hours of that campaign after the Weinstein story broke in the fall. And the collective impact of it was striking, but many women were not surprised at all. Because these are stories that we've been telling each other quietly for years, which were only now beginning to be heard. I want to be very clear. While the majority of the victims of sexual assault and harassment are girls and women, we know that trans and non-binary people are disproportionately targeted. We also know that boys and sometimes men are victimized as well. Sexual assault and harassment is so prevalent that it's no exaggeration to say that there are few women and trans folks who have not been confronted by this in their lifetimes. This is an epidemic. We know this, and we knew this, but as a society, we did not begin to really confront this openly and honestly until this past year, which is precisely why we need to talk about it today. 2 years ago, when the Access Hollywood video came out, a lot of women started to quietly make appointments to come and see me. Some of them were people I had never met before. One was a lifelong Jewish professional who trembled and wept as she said, "That woman waiting outside the bus in the video, I feel like she's me for the last 10 years. And that man with the Tic Tacs, he's my boss. I know that story too well. I just needed to tell someone." And by the way, that boss, like the actual guy with the Tic Tacs in the video, unfortunately still has his job. He remains both well-paid and highly respected in our Jewish community. Around that time, a head of a major Jewish foundation invited me to have with him a conversation about sexual harassment in Jewish communal life. He asked if I would be willing to share if, while working in the Jewish community, I had ever been sexually harassed by a boss, by a teacher, by a rabbi, a board member, or a funder. And at the end of the conversation, he told me that he had been conducting these interviews with Jewish women professionals for several months, and he had not yet met a single person who said that she had no experience of harassment. Literally not one. In the spring of my first year in college, I went to Take Back the Night. Have any of you ever been to a Take Back the Night? I marched and I shouted and I stayed up till the break of dawn, listening and weeping as hundreds of women lined up on the grassy quad, waiting for a chance to share their stories of torment and survival into the open mic. One woman spoke about suffering for many years from sexual abuse from her father and her brother, from the time that she was a very small girl. She spoke about how after many years she gathered the courage to tell her mother what was going on, but her mother did not believe her. She called her a whore and kicked her out of the house at 12 years old. It was the worst story I had ever heard. It still makes me cry to think about it. And yet here was this woman. She was so brave and she was so beautiful. She made it to Columbia. She was a survivor. It was dark out, but as this woman was speaking, I remember seeing that many of the women who were waiting online to speak stepped off the line and sat down. And after a few minutes, she noticed it too, and she cried out these words that I will never forget. "Please," she said, "do not let my story diminish yours. Your pain is real too. Your nightmares are real too. You do me no good by discounting your own suffering for the sake of mine. We all need healing, every one of us." This moment that we're living through right now is surfacing everything from violent assaults and childhood abuse to everyday sexist and demeaning assumptions and behavior. And all of it is evidence of how deep misogyny runs in our society. We have to be really careful when we hear the voices of Dina, to be both discerning and to keep perspective, and also not to diminish one another's experiences. And what about Shem? In our story, he's killed off by these vengeful brothers, driven first and foremost to protect the honor of their family. But this brutal act of rape is essentially a sidebar to our great family drama in the book of Genesis. There simply isn't a lot of traditional rabbinic commentary probing the question of what would drive a man like Shechem and other men like him to exert control over a woman's body. Shechem's attack is so brazen and so violent that it awakens us to the toxic reality of male power and female vulnerability, a dynamic that has not shifted through the many years of human civilization. So let's talk for a few minutes about the men, and sometimes the women, but usually the men, who inspired by jealousy or rage or passion, use their power to diminish other people. Remember how Mel Brooks lampoons the patriarchy and history of the world when he walks up to a woman and kisses her breasts, and as she giggles, turns to the camera and says, "It's good to be the king"? It's not only kings and some presidents who feel a sense of entitlement to women's bodies, who believe that they have a right to grab or smack or rub up against or even just comment on our breasts, our legs, our hips, our bellies. Every institution, every workplace has its kings. So politely squirm away when he seductively leans into you at the end of a meeting, his hot breath on your neck. Push back against a casual butt grab at the office or in the classroom or in the Target storage room or at an academic conference, and suddenly you're the problem. You can't take a joke. You're hysterical. Maybe you'll get a bad grade. Maybe you won't get published again. Maybe you'll get passed over for a promotion. Maybe you'll get fired. So who can blame you for smiling and pretending to go along with it? It's good to be the king. And at the same time, it is important for us on this day of self-scrutiny to recognize that culpability does not end with the offenders. The sheer prevalence of abuse and harassment now out in the open evidences a much larger circle of responsibility. Who is Jacob today? The one who remains silent in the face of harassment and abuse, trying instead to wish it away, to dull its impact, maybe absolve himself of responsibility. It's the Congressional Office of Compliance that hears claims of abuse by members of Congress and quietly issues fines, paid for by the taxpayers, thank you very much. It's the lawyers who use complex legal loopholes in order to help the richest and most powerful perpetrators cover up their crimes and protect their reputations. I'm sorry to say, it's the agents and it's the managers who continue to secure private meetings for their clients, even though they know that the big gun has a proclivity for young women. It's the university administrators who ignore claims of abuse from students about their coach as long as the team keeps winning. It's the church hierarchy that passes abusive priests from one parish to the next without public acknowledgement, without accountability. Just last month, after the grand jury in Pennsylvania named 301 priests in its report on church sex abuse in that state alone, we learned that many of the dioceses that were under investigation tried to prevent that report from ever being made public. They wanted to cover up the cover-up. There are over 1,000 children listed in that report who are victims of these priests and their abuse. 1,000 kids with lifelong trauma inflicted by their clergy and sanctioned by the church just in this one state. And investigators say that they are certain that the actual number is far greater. This is both systemic and systematic. And even as we focus on rampant sex abuse in the church, let us remember that it's also sometimes the rabbis and the day school heads and the camp directors and the federation execs who bend over backwards not to alienate funders who behave inappropriately or even abusively. How often in our Jewish community have we heard the open secrets about boards and executive leadership dismissing allegations against educators, scholars, and clergy in order to protect their reputations, instead letting them move on to their next position and their next round of potential victims? We are just now beginning to hear painful public revelations of this sort. And for every story told, there are so many survivors who are reluctant to share their stories because they're afraid not only of damaging their own reputations, but also potentially, God forbid, of fueling anti-Semitism. And what about the rest of us? What about the witnesses and the observers, the fans, who don't want to hear about our players, and the musicians that we love, who happen to be known for brutalizing their girlfriends and their wives? These are people who would never themselves harm another person, but actively support, sustain, and benefit from our toxic patriarchal culture. Yeah, sure, when the accused is a political foe who's buffoonishly evil, we're all outraged. But when have we stayed quiet or even quietly questioned the credibility of those who accuse our guys? The ones who call themselves feminists, the ones who fight for the causes that we believe in, the friends of our friends. I know that I have done this, and I know that I am not the only one in this room who has. This could never have become the epidemic that it is without many layers of cowardice and indifference, adding up to nothing short of complicity. As Anita Hill wrote this morning in an op-ed in the New York Times, with the heightened awareness of sexual violence comes heightened accountability. I know that this is not easy stuff. We do not want to hear about this, especially not on Yom Kippur. But isn't this exactly the time for us to confront the most challenging and painful breaches in our relationships and in our society? For the offense that we commit against you when we sexually demeaned another person. For the offense that we committed against you when we pretended that the toxic environment at our work and in our schools and in our community was not our responsibility. For the offense that we committed against you when we justified and ignored the culture of violence around us. For the offense that we committed against you when we were confused in times that demanded moral clarity. Are we not being asked to engage in exactly this self-scrutiny, to admit to our failings, to determine how we too could have behaved differently? I want to say that I know that this conversation might be particularly challenging for some of the men in the room. I'm talking about the people who are really decent, sometimes even in decidedly indecent environments. You're the ones who really do treat everybody fairly, who speak out when you see something that's not right. And I know that you're as disgusted by our culture of sexism and violence as I am. And I also know that maybe you felt over the course of this past year like you've been put on the defensive just by virtue of your manhood. So I want to just take a minute and thank you for not disengaging from this conversation, because we desperately need you to be a part of this conversation. We need your open hearts and open ears, and we need your support. We need you to keep bringing compassion and integrity into this conversation. We're raising our sons to be like you. I'm raising my son to be like you. It was Rambam, who was both a Torah scholar and a medical doctor, who taught that when the body ails, before we prescribe a treatment, we have to carefully identify the nature of an illness. Some illnesses require nothing more than a couple of days of rest. Others require invasive and dangerous surgeries. So too, Rambam said, with spiritual sicknesses. First, we have to determine the seriousness of the illness. Maybe all that's required is regret, an honest conversation, a commitment not to repeat the behavior. Or we might need to undergo major surgery in order to uproot the evil within, says Rambam. Last week, a well-known comedian inelegantly expressed his hope that the Me Too movement would just go away already. He was sharing his concern that offenders now are losing more than the victims ever did. He was pretty roundly condemned, and he did try to walk it back afterwards. But I know that he's not alone in thinking this way, that there are many people, maybe even some in this room, who would just like to move on already. But when it comes to sexual assault and sexual harassment and the toxic culture that perpetuates them, we need much more than 2 Tylenols and a couple of days of rest. This is not a surface injury. Surely the past year has revealed to us that assault and harassment in our culture are so prevalent and so deeply rooted that we as a society need to undergo a full-fledged collective reckoning to rout out, as Rambam would say, the greater evil within. It all starts with seeing survivors like Dina, hearing stories that, even when we really are okay now, still surface with a stubborn resilience and with little warning. Like this past weekend, when public allegations against a Supreme Court nominee of teenage sexual assault left many of us reeling with the resurfacing of our own experiences in high school, some of which we had safely locked away for decades. We need to hold space for these stories, not disputing or questioning or minimizing, not blaming survivors for the shame and confusion and self-doubt that is so often born of sexual assault and harassment, just hearing and holding and loving. And we also know that holding space is simply not enough, that we have to deal with Shechem. We have to get offenders out of positions of power in which they can continue to do harm. And ultimately, we are going to need to develop a restorative justice model for offenders to re-enter society with a real awareness of what they've done, of who they've hurt, and the debt that they now owe not only to their victims, but to everyone. Some of my colleagues, including Rabbi Danya Rutenberg and Gila Ben Shimol, are already taking the lead on this work. And perhaps most significantly, we need to contend with Jacob, and with the brothers, and with the rabbis, and with everyone else who perpetuates generation after generation a culture that is so profoundly unhealthy to girls and to women. We, too, are responsible for building a culture of radical accountability, for establishing a new set of cultural norms that will allow us all to flourish. Achartem oti, said Jacob to his sons, you have discomposed me. His son's violent revenge upset the order for him, shook his foundation, unsettled him. We need to discompose this culture of toxic masculinity. We need to unsettle generations-old assumptions about sex and power that have created fertile ground for the indignities that we are now seeing in the light of day. At some point this past winter, I took out a pen and I started to list my Me Too moments. I tried to focus strictly on incidents related to my rabbinate, meaning I didn't go back to my first job in the ice cream store when I was 14 years old, and my boss used to pull back my t-shirt every afternoon to see if my breasts had grown yet. In 10 minutes, I listed 27 incidents, 27 of them, some which could or even should have driven me from the rabbinate altogether. These incidents ranged from gross and insulting to downright terrifying. And I'm not even counting the vile, misogynistic, Nazi rape threat notes that I've gotten in just the past couple weeks since my LA Times op-ed on Chevron, and which I've frankly gotten every time I've published anything for the past decade. I put my pen away. But here's the thing. I'm still here. And you're still here. And I know some of you really well. I know that you have had to fight like hell to make it through the darkness that eclipsed everything and threatened to steal your dignity. And you are here after all of that. You're the living proof of what Hannah Gatsby taught us all. There's nothing stronger than a broken woman who has rebuilt herself. All of us, everyone in this room, needs to be part of the tikkun, the course correct for Dina, and for so many of our sisters and brothers who came before us, and for so many who are here today who were not heard when they needed to be heard, who were not held when they needed to be held, who were blamed and ignored and silenced. Here in this place, you are seen, you are believed, and you are loved. Our inheritance, our shared story, speaks not only to our great achievements, but also to our collective failures. And the difference between this year and last is that now we are talking about it. That is an important first step toward radical discomposition, toward shattering the code of silence and smashing the culture of complicity. Our rabbis warn that once things start to get stirred up in this societal tshuva, this healing process, we might become overwhelmed by the enormity of the disorder that's afflicting our system. And they're right. This moment feels overwhelming. It feels destabilizing. And yet, Rav Kook taught that discomfort, That inner anguish is the best indicator that we're finally doing the work that we need to do in order to heal. I recently learned about a Japanese art form called kintsugi, in which broken pottery is repaired with dusts made of powdered gold and silver. The philosophy is that we ought not erase or try to hide evidence of brokenness. Instead, breakage and repair become part of the history of an object, part of its story, part of its beauty. Our job in these coming months and years is to keep listening with tender hearts, to attune our ears to the voices that emerge from the white space between the black letters, the space that holds the stories not told by those with external power, but told by those with inner strength. And together to make dusts of powdered gold and silver, which we will use to fill the cracks in our hearts, in our sacred tradition, and in our society with a new beauty. Gamar Chatima Tova. I pray this is a year of healing for all of us.